Want to nail engineering manager interviews at FAANG and other top-tier companies? You can with USA's #1 tech interview prep platform. We have 300 plus SMEs and instructors from top-tier tech companies to help you land your dream job. We've helped thousands of engineers make their way into FAANG. You could be next. To learn more, register for our free webinar.
Let's see here. Just so I have a quick note, which questions have we covered so far? Because I don't want to double up on stuff.
We did the defer with the express.
Okay, middleware.
Yeah, we did the middleware. We did the drop down.
Okay.
We did the remove the zeros or
Yep.
no repeating numbers.
Yep. Count unique.
Yeah, I just did another front end building JavaScript widget.
Okay. Was it one of the like tooltip or something like that, or?
I can show you what I can't think I got it popped up here. It was the like just to click around and you make a box and click around. Let me show you here.
Okay.
So he sent me this one. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
So he just sent me this. Basically, put buttons here and then click the pink button and move it around.
Okay. So basically, like the sliding puzzles.
Yeah. So it went pretty well. Could have done better, but yeah. I mean, I didn't finish it completely, but I finished it after we were done. But
okay.
So yeah.
That's actually awesome. And I'm always curious too, because like not all of our questions are fully up there yet. Let me create this interview guide, make sure it matches the experience.
Yeah, it was a good one. It was good.
Sweet. All right. Let's see here. So what we're gonna do then? Let's see here. We already did drop down. I don't want to do something too close to drop down. Let's see here. I think what we'll do is we'll keep hammering on some of the CS and JavaScript stuff, because I think that's generally having generalist JavaScript preparation is going to be the most valuable use of your time.
Okay.
There's going to be basic JavaScript questions somewhere in the interview loop.
Right.
They're going to be closer to things like the count unique. There will be some kind of UI which will look like either the drop down or the puzzle with chows, where it's JavaScript behavioral type stuff.
Okay.
The sliding puzzle is very much in that same implementation UI hybrid question, like HTML, CSS, JavaScript, make this thing behave the way we describe it.
Okay.
So
yeah,
that
I mentioned kind of when I was talking to him after, he kind of said like, we don't really care how you get it done as long as you get it working. Would you agree with that?
That is a very Google sentiment, but I find that generally, especially for behavioral JavaScript, and because of the time constraints, you should always focus on completion first.
Okay.
And then iteration.
Okay.
And so, yeah, like whether it's blue, whether or not your little arrow thing is centered, doesn't really matter.
Okay. Yeah, he actually had mentioned like for the light blue area, just forget about the arrows and just put buttons in there.
Yeah.
Like an up, down, left, right button.
Yep.
So he didn't really care about that so much. But he had just said like, we don't care about how you get it done. You get it done, and then we have a conversation about what you would do to make it better, is essentially kind of what that was his advice to me. I'm sure everyone feels a little bit different, about that. But
yeah, there are some shops I can think of that really focus on the quality of the code, but they'll also tell you up front. So LinkedIn, for example, used to have an interview question that was around semantic markup for your resume. They would take your resume, whether it was a LinkedIn profile or otherwise, and say, hey, you've got this. Obviously, I want you to cut this down a little bit so that it fits within 45 minutes. But using semantic markup, using the best markup possible, I want you to mark up your resume. And then we're going to talk about the tags that you pick. We're going to talk about the container elements you choose, your class names, any additional elements you add, why you add them, why you don't add them, and we'll go from there. And that's one of the examples I can think of which was very quality centric.
Yeah, I can see that one being.
But again, that's loaded up in the very beginning where they say, the best markup possible. And to make sure it fits, they tell you to strip away a lot of other things. Like, don't put all your positions in, just put one of them in for now. Things like that. I think especially with the 45-minute cap on a lot of these interviews, you definitely need to cut it down. Like, you have to get to functional first.
Right. Okay.
So today for the exercise we're going to be doing, we're going to be working with, let's see here. Oh, only editable by its creator. Fine. So in terms of layout, we can actually hide the browser window. We can click on the test thing if we want. This is a collaborative editor mode, so you can see my cursor moving around here.
Okay.
And assuming everything works, we should be good. So what we're doing today is we're going to be dealing with a large API data set. We've abbreviated it for the purpose of this exercise because we're actually interested in something called an exclusion list, or like a filter, for example. And the way it works is we've got our function here labeled const exclude, which takes a list of items and a list of exclusions. And what we want to do is, given the list, we want to, well, exclude everything in the exclusions. So, for example, if I do something like this, I pass in items, and then I pass in an array as the second element, which is my list of exclusions. And the first one is, the key is K, and the key is color, and the value is red. Then I want to remove all of the items which contain a key of color and a value of red. So in calling this, I would effectively end up with something like, I'd have the blue TV, the new silver phone, and the old silver phone.
Okay, so we're excluding or passing in the items array, and then we're just returning back any of the objects, essentially a new array with K of color, V of red. So any color any color value of red.
Yep. If the key color is set to the value red, we want to omit it.
Key color is set to the value red. We want to turn it. Okay.
Yeah. So we could expand this if we want for simplicity here. We could say key and value like this.
Okay.
And so we could see this being used in something like a client-side filter or something like that, where the API gives us back the total result set, but we want to filter down what's visible to the user.
Right. Okay. Okay. And well, we can use any built-in JavaScript functions for this.
Yeah, and then we'll add requirements once we get a working version, and we'll iterate and refactor as we go.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to pass in a list of exclusions. We're going to return the list. So essentially what I would do is basically just filter on the list, look for any properties essentially that don't include the color of red. If they don't, then just return that list. So I think we can do something like, let's see. So we have our list. So I think we can just return the list directly and just say, so our exclusions, we have an exclude array, key color value red. Exclude items, key color value red, blue TV, new silver phone, old silver phone. So we're going to exclude on the items key color value red. Color value. So the key relates to the color value red. So I know we want to filter out on the list, and we want to compare the list item of the color with the value. So I know we can do something like list dot. I know we can find a property. We just have to compare the key and the value on the items. So if we pass in a list dot find. So I know for each item we want to look at the key and see if the value is red. So I think we could do something like list.find because we can allow using list.find. That would find a specific value, find index with the index. So we definitely want to filter on the value. And then we would want to pass in an item. Excludes is an object key color value red. List.filter. So for each item, filter item. So if the item excludes list.filter item excludes item key color value red. So we have a list, we have a filter item color value. Remove that array. The item, so passing in the item. So I know for each item we have obviously a color, and we want to map the color. Items key color value red. So for each item we know we're going to have a color. We need to compare the key of the item. So list.filter item excludes.
Well, let me ask you something here. It looks like we're going to have to loop twice, once over the list and once over the exclusions. Do you have a preference in order in terms of which one you want to loop over first?
Well, I would think if we're going to do a double loop, we would want to loop over probably the exclusions first.
Okay. Okay. So I'm just kind of documenting here what we've got in terms of our filters. We know that if we loop over the exclusions and we loop over each list item, I don't think there's anything wrong with filter. If you're not familiar with how filter works, we can also do this with loops.
Yeah, I mean, I know the filter returns a value. You know, it filters the array based on truthy values. My trying to figure out how it can connect the excludes to the list of attributes, basically. So I know it loops over. I know listing. I use filter a lot. I'm just trying to figure out what the correct comparison is. But we could get it working with a double loop and then go from there. So we could say for let exclusion of exclusions. Or exclusion of exclusions. So we're going through the list of exclusions, which is going to be key color and value red. And then we're going to basically go through each let item of the list. So essentially we have the exclusions and we have the items. We'd also need to create basically a new array then and return that array. A new array for that exclusion of exclusions for that item of list. And then basically we would just basically need to say if exclusion, just can't think right now. If the exclusion dot the exclusion of the key. So if the exclusion of the key, which is essentially going to be the color, equals the exclusion of the key equals the item of the list. So basically for each item, brain's not working. If the exclusion of the key equals the item,
Well, let's store some of these computations just as kind of shortcuts to help out. So I think you're right. You have the exclusion. So exe, and then there's a dot key. It looks like, and we can call that something. So like, we'll call it key, and we've got the value for that exclusion, right? So now if we've got the key and the value, now we want to check the list dynamic property for the key.
right? So we would go through and just check to see if the item of the key equals the, I can't, let's see, if the const key exec.key that item of list, const key equals exec.key. So we have the key, which is color. The value is red if the item of the key equals item of the key is going to be red. So you would just basically say if the item of the key is the val, and well, I would say if it does not equal the val, then new array dot push the item, and then I guess I would return the new array here. Do we need to return the actual initial list?
Nope. We can just return new array on line 26 there. Awesome.
So basically it's checking if the item of the key is not equal to red, basically. So if color is not red, then push the new item in and then return that after the loop. So we're doing a double loop here. Looping through the exclusions first. So
awesome.
Yeah, I mean, I could see how we could transition this to a filter. We could basically just loop through one piece and then just get the values. We'd probably need to map somehow the exclusions though to a key and a value like we are, and then loop through the list of items with a filter and then compare the two.
Yeah, I think what we've got is pretty good, and it'll definitely help us out for sort of the next set of requirements here. Just because I think right now we've got this double loop going on, and even if we do a filter, ultimately a filter is a loop into itself.
Yeah.
And it's very much like the runtime on this, if you don't mind walking through it here, should be pretty high.
Yeah, we have a double loop, so we have a nested loop, so the n squared based on the size of the array. I mean, we have to go through the exclusions, and then we're going to go through for each exclusion, we're going to basically run through the entire items array, and we're going to do that basically for every exclusion. So we're going to run through both n amount, n value or n length of both arrays.
Yeah, and unfortunately, there's not really a good way to optimize that either. But in the browser, talk to me about how that can cause problems. So, like, where can n squared type runtimes really screw us up?
As far as like the program itself, or
just like runtime. Like when we see something that's got a list like this, we don't know how big the API response is. How can that go wrong in the browser?
Well, it can. I mean, if there's going to be a huge list, it can definitely cause the browser to crash. Performance will slow down, obviously. Um, it just basically holds up the rest of the program. Um, the rest of the Yeah, I mean, the program's going to be a lot slower, obviously.
Yeah. No, I think you're completely right that when the list is unknown, like because this is a synchronous loop, we're going to block all JavaScript while it chunks its way through this massive list.
Yeah.
Right now it's easy because it's, 4 items, but so help us if it's suddenly like, 4 million items. I hope they never do that. But this could also, while we're talking about this right now in context of filtering, this could easily be a pattern for like a graph visualization on the browser or something like that. At which point now we are dealing with millions of nodes and locking up UI could cause problems. So the second piece of this exercise then is we should figure out how to make this asynchronous. The biggest thing that I can offer as guidance is we're going to pass an onComplete function here. Assuming nothing else changes other than the requirement. We're going to have a callback function that we pass as our third parameter. So we have a list, our exclusions, and an onComplete function. And when it's done, it's going to give us back the result. And by default, we can make it work here by just saying, instead of returning, just calling onComplete with our result. We've added the callback support, but we're not asynchronous yet. So this is kind of the patchwork to kind of upgrade it. So they pass in the function that they want here, a result, takes result, and they just echo it out. And in our function here, we're taking it as a third parameter. And on line 26, we're outputting it. What I'd love to do here for the remainder of our time, and we'll go until we hit the stopping point, is I would love your help in making this work asynchronously so that we're no longer blocking the UI thread when we have large numbers of items or a huge exclusion list.
Okay. And we are assuming that we're getting this from some endpoint.
Yeah, we're not worried about the endpoint. We're more worried about just making the exclude function work asynchronously for us.
Okay. So as far as working asynchronously, the two thoughts that come to mind would be some sort of promise or async await to get the values, but we're not really making an asynchronous call to get those values. My thought would be like an async await function. You can call that, and then we can basically pause this function, come out of it, and then execute the rest of the program code while this is executing, and then jump back into this function and finish. But it sounds like that's not what we're looking for, right?
I think what we're looking for here is right now we've got these 2 for loops which run synchronously. And we need to find a way to sort of break that up. Like, there's probably a half dozen different strategies we can use. I'm happy to suggest some in terms of how we can sort of break this synchronous block that runs from line 15 to line 22-ish here. Because right now that those back-to-back for loops are going to run.
Yeah,
they're going to run hard.
Yeah, it's going to be slow. Make them asynchronous. So we're not making any API call. We're going to just make an asynchronous loop. If we want to make an asynchronous loop, but where's the asynchronous? So we're just making the two for loops asynchronous?
We need to find a way to, so if we have, say, we'll use list as an example. We'll say the list has 400 million items. If we go through all 400 million items all at once, we're going to freeze up the UI for like a second or more where everything's going to be unresponsive. So what we want to do is we want to do a chunk of comparisons, release the thread so that if we're doing any rendering or things in the background, those can continue. And then do like the next batch and then do the next batch. And then when it's all done, then we want to actually manage the result.
Okay. As far as making the loop asynchronous with chunking, I'm not sure exactly what that would look like. So I know we could.
Yeah, well, let's start breaking that down then. So, what do we have at our disposal that makes things asynchronous?
As far as a for loop or just general asynchronous, you have promises, async await.
Okay. What else do we have?
You have observables.
Yep. We've got good old set timeout.
Yeah, you get set timeout, set interval, all those timers.
Or if you're a node person.
Tick. Okay.
And I think set interval also technically qualifies in this like sort of grouping.
Right. So those items will wait for basically the stack to clear, and then they'll execute anything in the timeout.
Yeah. So we've got a handful of different ways. These are all natively asynchronous ways that we can sort of do some work and wait for a response. Right. Of these, which ones are you most comfortable with? And I think we'll kind of explore that.
Well, set timeout is probably the most native to JavaScript. Observables I've used quite often. I mean, I'm familiar with all of them. I'm trying to wrap my head around how we could wait for those values. I guess we could wrap it in a set timeout and wait a specific amount of time, and then execute. But I'm not quite sure how that would benefit unless we're wrapping the entire loop in a set timeout.
Probably not the entire loop, but I do think you're on the right track where if instead of keeping track of like just kind of doing this in the for loop and iterating over these items, what if we kept track of our position? So we had something like list index right? And then we have a function inside of this which does our check. So we'll call it check. And now we can start taking some of our code and putting it in this check. So we could say, well, we'll say exe equals exclusions exclusion index. And item equals list list index. So we've basically taken our for loops and we've said, well, let's base those on an external counter. Right?
Right. So you're okay.
And then we have our logic. So first off, because our loop is set up, we want exclusions followed by lists, right?
Right.
So we exit early if we've exhausted all the exclusion lists. So if we go through and we say, hey, get the next index, and let's say there is nothing there, then we're out of exclusions and we're done. If there's no item, then we've exhausted this current exclusion list or this current list.
Yeah, the items. Okay.
So we would want to advance our exclusion index, reset the list index, and check again. At this point, we've now got two different ways of controlling our indexes. And we have our call from before with key and value. So we've got our key, we've got our value, and we're going to add these items. And we're going to increment and dispatch check. So because every time we basically are iterating through the exclusions and then the items, we would want to say, okay, check the next item.
Right. So
which is our list index.
Yeah, the list index.
So by default, at this point, we haven't actually changed anything other than putting our logic into this sort of check function, which is a lot easier to make asynchronous. So we can do this a couple different ways. What I'm going to do here is comment out our lower block there. So if we call check by default here as part of exclusion lists, it'll start our first check, and right now it's still fully synchronous. But what we can do is say, hey, every time we want to check something, and we'll use set timeout because that's, I think, the easiest to wrap our head around right now. Anytime we want to call check, instead of calling check immediately, we can basically say, hey, run the check on the next available UI thread.
Okay.
Don't run it right away. And what that does is that basically says, okay, we're going to go through, we're going to run everything. JavaScript has an event stack. So as soon as we say set timeout, it's going to put a call to check on the event stack.
Yep.
And then it's going to stop caring until the event comes back around on the event stack. So it might be dealing with click handlers. It might be dealing with scroll handlers. It might be handling AJAX responses. Eventually, this is going to come back up again, and it's going to look at our index and item. It's going to go through and do our steps. And when it's finally done with exclusions, it'll call our onComplete function.
Right. Yeah, I mean that all is very clear. It's understandable for sure. Yeah.
The hardest part, I think, is with a question like this, and we can talk about some of the feedback on this, is sort of having to invert the way we think about these functions. I remember when we did our middleware stuff, We got tripped up again on the process of closures and callbacks and sort of how to do the library level asynchronous code. And I don't, there's nothing wrong with that. Like, I think it's probably one of the most frustrating pieces of JavaScript. Like, hands down, it's the thing that literally makes no effing sense in the language whatsoever. Especially at the library level. Like, there is nothing intuitive about line 38 there. Like, I know that I've been doing this long enough to know that this is where shit comes off the rails. So overall, like the score is a 3. It's a pass on the interview. If you were like applying for like a high level senior position, it would probably be a 2. And the reason is because when it comes to they would expect at the senior level for you to start working with library functions and sort of understanding the underlying library piece. But if it were just a blanket software engineer, like I guess like a level 5 at Facebook or something like that, like it'd be a 2 to 3. It would not pass for like a level 6, which is like a staff engineer.
Okay.
And a lot of that comes down to just familiarity with the mechanics of how callbacks work or how to basically make something asynchronous.
Yeah, I think that's the part that tripped me up here is just making it asynchronous. I mean, I can talk about closure and all the callback stuff and first class functions and all that stuff. I mean, if you just asked me a general question about it, I could answer it. It's just, I think the asynchronous part tripped me up. I mean, reading the code makes complete sense what's going on. I mean, you can understand it completely. As far as passing in the callback, executing it, the check function closes over the exclude function, so it has access to all the variables in its scope, even if it's executed somewhere else. That all makes sense. The set timeout makes sense. The set timeout as far as waiting for the call stack to clear and then executing. As far as it executing on another UI thread, I didn't think about it in that sense. So I think that was a eye opener a little bit for me. So that'll help a lot. But I understand like set timeout puts the callback on the check function on the callback queue, and once the execution stack is empty, then it executes the check function. So that part of it makes sense. As far as making it asynchronous, I know you can simulate a lot of like promise functionality with set timeout and stuff like that. So that I should have thought about that, but.
Well, and it doesn't have to be set timeout either. Set timeout's probably the easiest. If you're really familiar with the observables API, if you remember with observables, the thing that's really important about observables is it's a triggered event. So when you talk about observables, you're talking about using like RxJS or something like that, right?
Yeah, like subscribing to events and.
Yeah, so let's see here. Let me find. I'm trying to remember if it's actually the core observable or it's an async subject. You'll have to help me out here because it's been about 3 years since I've done observables.
It would be like a core observable.
Okay. Quickly catching up here. Relearning how observables work.
Yeah, we usually work with Angular, at least my work. We work at Angular and RxJS.
There we go. Lazy push collections of multiple values. Sweet. All right. So that's not imported. That's fine. We'll just grab observable here at the top of the file. We're going to pretend that it's imported. Actually, I wonder if I can just do that. Let me check here. Files, dependencies, RxJS. Yes, just give me RxJS. Hey, what do you know? We now have observables.
All right.
Sometimes Code Sandbox, it's helpful.
Yeah, it's one of the better ones for sure.
All right, so we've got instead Let's make our array an observable. So new observable, and we need this takes a function, which is our subscriber. Ooh, it's been a while. All right. And this is every time we trigger it, it's going to get a next, right?
Right.
Um,
Next or an error.
and then we want to, so with our subscriber, every time we call subscriber.next, we're going to want to iterate through. So here we can make our stuff async. We can actually do, here's where we do our indexing, I guess. And I'm going to put a question mark on that line because I can't remember whether or not when you call subscriber.next, if that actually calls synchronously or it's already been properly extracted. I actually don't remember. It's been a while. Like I said, it's been a while. But now, let's see here. It's our observable. We then have observable.subscribe. And then we've got our function. So we've got next with our params. And we can actually do the same kind of logic we were doing in our check function. Now within our observable subscriber, adding to this next array object, and on complete, calling our onComplete function. So if we were to do this with observables, we would need to basically queue up all of our changes. We could potentially, I haven't actually done push and pull on observables since they came out. But you could, in theory, do the check and immediately push the next value onto the observable, which would resolve in the stack as needed. This is a little bit harder for me because like observables are not something I use regularly. But
Yeah,
I'm hoping I can at least kind of illustrate how this would work for you.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think in an interview setting, set timeout, if it accomplishes the same thing for the point of an interview, I mean, I think set timeout is the way to go. I think there's a little bit more setup work with the observable path.
There is, but it's the same basic idea of what's the asynchronous trigger that lets you move the next calculation back onto the event stack. And we can also do them in batches. There's no reason you couldn't say, well, let's go through, we think 100 items on the list and 100 items in the exclusion is not enough to slow us down. So we'll basically permutate and do 100 list items by 100 exclusions, and then we'll set timeout and ask for the next one.
Right.
So we could basically do like 10,000 next calls and then set timeout and do it again. So we could basically chunk it up however we wanted. My recommendation with an interview is by default to fall back to set timeout or promises.
Yeah. Okay.
You can, in theory, do it with promises. If you're going to do promises, the first thing you would do is something like this, or and now you've got your check function. It's asynchronous. You can actually move stuff outside. So you could be like, we'll say this is a current list. These are just made up. Do await checked value. And then we can come up here to like line 17-ish and actually make a promise. So const check value, because we want this to be a promise, item and exclusion. We don't need the reject function. And now we can basically make it asynchronous here. By default, promises are asynchronous, but if there was ever any doubt, you could actually do this. Let's see here.
And that would be to essentially simulate like an API call or something.
It could be for either an API call or even just freeing up the main thread, so that we're not chunking on stuff. This is effectively giving us a promise. And now we have on line 49, we can actually calculate exclude, which is done asynchronously. And then we could actually do the increment. So we could do our actual check. So we could do like do our out of bounds checks.
Yeah.
And if not complete, call check again. And you could actually do this a couple different ways. We could actually have so what we're doing here, just as an example, in 48 through 60, we've basically made the determination as to whether or not something should be excluded as the asynchronous piece of this operation.
Okay. Okay.
To make a function release the UI thread, basically you need to find one key point that you're going to call again and again, like your bulk operation, and sever that. This another option, and this goes back to another interview question I don't think we've done yet, is that check function can be throttled. So if we had Lodash or something like that, we could throttle the function that says, hey, this function can only be called once a maximum of every 2 milliseconds.
Right.
Don't let it get called any faster than this. and it would actually throttle the throughput for us.
Which essentially handles that segmenting the UI.
Yeah, or we could use a chunk function that would like break it up into chunks of 100 or something like that. There's, like I said, there's a lot of different strategies. The challenge is really just figuring out how to take something that's synchronous and how to make it asynchronous. And there's a couple different ways that we've got here. So we've got the start of a promises example. We've got our observable example. And then down below, we had the example that had set timeout, which is by and far the easiest way, but it does kind of steer you towards a callback by default. If they want promises, they'll probably ask for promises. So coming back, final feedback, how to practice for something like this. Take something that's synchronous. Like you can even look through your own code of stuff and be like, how do I take loops? How would I write some asynchronous versions of these functions? And so you can basically take any function that's currently synchronous and say, well, what would the async version of this be like? What would the pattern for this be like? And if you're looking for ideas, if you hit up the underscore website, _JS, any of the collection functions. So at the very top, they've got a set for collections, which are basically globs of things. If you take a look at like each or map, these look very familiar. You can actually turn those into exercises to practice. Like if I had, we'll use map because I think we know what map looks like in ES6. How do you take the map function and make an asynchronous version of map so that if you're going over several million items, you're not doing it all at once?
Okay.
I don't know anyone that currently asks async reduce, but that's a horrible enough question that I totally expect that somebody somewhere has that in their docket.
I'll get that one.
I mean, I'm just saying, like, if you want to practice, like, that's probably the best way to practice this pattern. Is I know what reduce looks like. I've written dozens of reduce functions. How do I make it asynchronous? How do I make async reduce, which takes the same signature as reduce, but returns a promise that will resolve with the result of the reduction?
Yeah, it's a good one to practice.
It's just, I'll just say, it's just bullshitty enough that you know that's the kind of question you'll see in an interview. It's tight, it's concise, it works on an API you already know, and it's, oh, let's just make it async. And it's like, oh, how hard could it be? Well, that's a 45-minute interview question for a reason.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's good. That's good to know. It's good practice.
And it's just practicing and building that comfort level with curried functions, with basically like flinging functions around, having functions that are objects that can be called and instantiated as needed, passing in the callback as a function that you can call. We didn't do any of the error checking to test whether or not even onComplete exists, and then choosing whether it's a synchronous or an asynchronous resolution. That's all stuff that can be done at another point.
Right.
But that probably gives you enough to get started. That's how I would practice for these. It's just that sort of, how do I take something like this? How do I transfer it? And functions are by and far the hardest part of these interviews. I'd be shocked for a JS position if you didn't get something that was callback or currying or in that sort of like awful functional space.
Yeah, I think I think it's just identifying where to do that. I mean, I again, like, I know currying, I know callbacks and all that. It's just like, if I was writing something like this, I guess I wouldn't, it's just a different way of writing it. So I need to kind of be able to identify when to do that. I mean, the first way you wrote it would be my first way of doing it if I kind of been able to put it together as far as just using the set timeout. But the other ones make sense too. I mean, I assume that each check function, one's just using async await, one's using set timeout, and one's using, the promise. But
And deep down under the hood, everybody eventually results in set timeout.
yeah, everyone's using it under the hood.
But yeah, I mean, it's helpful to find which patterns work for you. Because how to deal with a callback function is just going to be a common pattern. Whether it's debounce and throttle, which is another common interview question, or something like this where we're making asynchronous code.
Yeah, this is a good problem because this would be good to practice.
Yeah, and like I said, underscore source is all open and available, which makes it really easy to sort of check your work on the base functionality before you add the asynchronous code. And with something like Code Sandbox, you can even actually test it very easily. Write tests for it if you want. It works really well.
Code Sandbox, yeah, okay.
Yeah, it's a good running environment. You can also do it locally, but it is nice to be able to save it and check it and be able to get an ES6 environment with literally no effort.
Yeah,
I just literally went in and under a Code Sandbox, said create a new React app. And that automatically gives you React scripts, which does ES6 transpilation for you.
Okay.
So you don't even have to really think about it, which is great.
Yeah, that's nice.
And then I just deleted the contents of app.js because we didn't care.
So in an interview setting, would they have you write tests for some of this as well?
If there's time.
There's time for it.
But generally, my experience is if you can get to test, you're nailing the interview.
Okay.
If you write tests first, I would say don't sacrifice completing the interview for the sake of tests. And that's going to be a time management question based on your comfort level. If you think you can get tests in place in addition to solving it, do the tests. If you can't, just give yourself some basic input-output tables. Like, here's what I think is supposed to happen. If I have this call, here's what should happen. If I have this call, here's what should happen.
Okay. Yeah, it's just a little bit different dynamic of a question. So this is good to just keep hitting me with the different ones. And
yeah, these are the kind. I mean, the hard part is there's such a broad set of front-end questions.
Yes.
That prepping for it, I think the general stuff like the UI questions, I think you do much stronger on. And so it's just these weird JavaScript questions that inevitably come up in a world where everything is on Ember, Vue, Angular, React. Like, you're going to get core JS questions, especially at a senior level.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, senior's the goal. I mean, that's what I'm shooting for. So that's what I'm going to target, and we'll kind of see. And obviously I know I have some work to go, but I've got 10 more interviews. I'm going to try to focus them on this part of the interview and do some behavioral, but until I can start knocking these out a little bit better.
Yeah, I totally understand.
I'd rather.
And you can with Chow as well. You can ask him to, like, hey, can you give me a question that is more CS focused or less UI focused? And he has, obviously Google has a lot of questions like that as well.
Yeah.
And so he can make sure he's asking you strong questions as well that are pushing on the sort of core JavaScript competency.
Yeah, I think the UI, the widget and stuff, I think those things I can, those are, there's only a certain number of widgets and a certain number of ways you can kind of do something. I think I can, I am practicing those, but yeah, there's a million different questions, but it's just, that's why I'm here. So.
Awesome. All right. I'm going to get this feedback in. Have a good interview with Chow next week, and we'll connect again because sounds like we're going to be doing some more of this stuff.
Yeah, we will be. I got 10 left.
All right. You're going to run me out of questions at this rate. So,
I want to see them all.
I think you're well on your way.
Good. Thanks.
All right.
All right.
Take care.
All right.